white people didn't steal rock and roll. So let's get that out the way right now. And I'm gonna make this very clear because music is a universal language and is colorblind. But without education, we would never know. So now you're gonna get the full story from me. The whole thing was that Elvis Presley, the Beach Boys, Jerry Lee Lewis, and of course the British invasion. You know, the Beatles, the Who, the Rolling Stones, that whole situation. Those became the three biggest entities on the white side in rock and roll because, as we know, rock and roll is created by the African American black experience. I mean, going from Little Richard to Chuck Berry and going back even further with T Bone Walker and Muddy Waters and a whole bunch of other people that played a very strong, significant role on the blues side to make rock and roll what it was. Because technically, rock and roll is a subgenre of R&B, or as Little Richard would say, rhythm and blues had a baby and they called it rock and roll. It don't get no plainer than that. So that's to let people know that if you look at some of the clips in these performances by Chuck Berry and Little Richard, if you look into the audience, you'll see the majority of white people. So don't think for one second that a lot of those young white boys weren't going home and trying to learn how to play like Little Richard and like Chuck Berry. And how do I know this? Because John Lennon was one of them. Matter of fact, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, because as some of y'all may know, if y'all ever seen a Beatles interview, the first two names that come up out of Paul and John's mouth is Little Richard and Chuck Berry. So that goes to show you right then and there. And of course, when you learn something from somebody, it's your job to take what you learn, absorb it. You may sound like them in the beginning, but you eventually begin to develop your own style. And as my legendary granddad always says, everybody gets something from somebody until they develop into their own thing. And that's just the way that it is. So a lot of key things happened that led to the white domination of rock and roll. And I'm going to give it to you, so listen up very closely. Not only those three entities, but Little Richard decided to give up rock and roll and focus on gospel and even became a minister, whereas Chuck Berry went to jail for dealing with a 13-year-old white girl, minor, you know, whatever you want to call it. And it really put a dent into the black experience that we were having for rock and roll. So that gave a lot of open door room for a lot of new cats to come in that were mostly white and studying blues and early jazz stuff. So it really became an open lane. And at the same time as that door was opening for most white musicians to come in and do their thing, Motown happened. Motown, and then of course a couple years after that, Stax Volt and Atlantic Records, and then of course James Brown, his own entity, that created soul, R&B, and funk, and of course giving props to Ray Charles as well for helping to bring in the soul element due to a lot of his contributions with gospel and melding it with a lot of these different influences. So that left the door open. So by 1962, 1963, blacks were no longer really synonymous with rock and roll, even though we were topping the charts and competing with the Beatles for space, especially Motown. You know, the epic battles between the Supremes' number one hits and the Beatles knocking them off, or vice versa, is legendary. But that pretty much became the open door. So what happened was is that I like to think in my mind that most of us black folks got very comfortable with the soul funk R&B element, which which is nothing wrong with that because I love it. I mean, that's pretty much in our DNA, and we got comfortable. So when we began to let the record industry give us the image of who we were and what we did and what was our whole mo, we got comfortable. And I'll give you an example why that's true. Because if you notice, unfortunately, and I hate to say this every time I talk about it, it makes me cringe, but a lot of blacks didn't support Jimi Hendrix when he hit like the comet, when he hit pay dirt and blew up. A lot of blacks didn't support Jimi Hendrix. A lot of people thought that Jimmy wasn't down enough or wasn't hip enough because he basically grew up in a different arena. You know, he really got his pay and his due when he went to London because, as everybody knows, Jimmy was playing with everybody with Joey D. the Starlighters, in which my granddad gave Jimi Hendrix his first job outside of Ozzy Brothers and Curtis Knight and all those guys. They really became a certain situation that people just really couldn't get past, and that was the fact that Jimmy grew up in a different environment and had a different outlook and he focused his area on taking the blues element and amplified it even more. So, of course, with that being said, by 1965, 66, groups like Cream, Led Zeppelin, and Ted Nugent, the MC5, all these guys were listening to blues records. Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath was called Earth in the beginning, and they were a blues band before they became known as the creators of heavy metal. So that goes to show you once again how much rock and roll is derivative from the black African American experience. And unfortunately, Jimmy, became the greatest guitar hero in that period. And right along the wayside behind them, of course, was Funkadelic.